Hello, my name is Fred Haight, and this is my contribution to the Chained Muse website, a most valuable website, in celebration of the birthday of the great English poet John Keats. Most of my adult life has been spent in the defense of classical culture, with a special emphasis on music, the area of my training. But I have a great love and passion for classical poetry. It were not an exaggeration to say that if the other forms of classical culture could be characterized as endangered species, poetry is on life support. One thing must be understood. When I say classical, I do not mean old or ancient. I'm simply referring to the standards it has to live up to, and I am confident that there will be much great classical poetry written in the future, beginning now. I place great emphasis on reciting poetry aloud. That does not mean that if you simply read it aloud, you'll get the correct reading. In fact, it's the opposite. You're going to have to work harder in order to recite a classical poem than you will a classical piece of music. Why? Because conservatories still exist which maintain the art of how to take something written on paper, such as a score, and translate it into sound. The only place where that still exists for the spoken word is in classical theater. Of course, there are close relationships between poetry and theater, but to my knowledge, no institution, at least in the English-speaking world, exists to teach the proper way to recite poetry. And it is urgent that such an institution come into being. There are several reasons for reading poetry aloud. One, language originated in poetry, not prose. Most people think that poetry is a specialized form of prose. No. Poetry was the means of communication for centuries, sometimes long before written language was even invented in that particular part of the world. Here you see the Rig Veda, one of the ancient Sanskrit documents. The Vedas and the Upanishads were repeated from memory for centuries before they were written down. In this scene at the center, you see the great blind Greek poet Homer, who wrote about the earlier Trojan Wars. Didn't write about them, made up an epic poem about them, assembled a school of students he called bards, and had each of them memorize different parts of it so that they could travel about Greece telling these stories to help the Greek people understand their own history and understand some of the mistakes that had been made so that they could learn from those mistakes. Why were these stories told in poetry rather than in the form of prose? Several reasons. Let us begin with metaphor. Metaphor, ambiguity, irony. All of these things may seem to require more words to get the idea across since they are less specific, but actually they require fewer. The German word for poetry is Dichtung, which means condensing, and poetry always condenses the thoughts to less than it would take in prose. The literalist assumes that his audience has no mind and he must spell everything out for him. The poet knows that the audience knows a lot, and a right-placed metaphor is going to bring all their thoughts flowing forward to them You don't need to spell everything out. In the literal method, you're trying to brainwash your audience to believe what you want them to believe. In this method, you are enabling them to make a discovery on their own, which, because they've made that discovery, they own it. It's theirs. It's not something you've told them to think. Thus, the method of metaphor, irony, and ambiguity is more efficient than any kind of literalism. In this scene, Parnassus, by the great painter Raphael, Parnassus was the mountain in Greece where the poets gathered, the bards and the muses. You see several leading poets in it: Dante, Virgil, Homer, Petrarch, Sappho, Horace. You see Apollo, the god, playing his braccia in the middle, and he is surrounded by the 9 muses, from which our modern term music comes. There were muses for tragedy, comedy, astronomy, history, melody, harmony, lyric poetry, tragic poetry, love poetry. And their mother was a goddess named Mnemosyne, which meant memory. Why was memory the mother of them all? That's very important. You may have heard of the term mnemonic. That comes from Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory. Mnemonic means things that help you remember something. The bards had to memorize incredibly long passages. And if you're going to memorize something that long, then you will find that certain elements of poetry, such as the verse, number of lines in a verse, not only the number of feet in a line, but the shape of a line, and a rhyme scheme, all are mnemonic devices that make it easier to remember such long passages. And prose derives from poetry. It's just less organized. A paragraph, for example, in prose derives from a verse or stanza in poetry, but it's not as tight, not as rigorous. There is another reason for reading poetry aloud. Music derives from the human singing voice, and poetry derives from the human speaking voice. Classically trained opera singers have to employ the bel canto method, which is the only really scientific method of singing, in order to not only produce a beautiful tone, but be able to project and fill a concert hall. And classically trained actors know that there is also a bel canto approach to a trained speaking voice as there is for a singing voice. You have to fill a theater either way, and you have to have breath control either way. Whether you are speaking or singing, there are musical aspects to language, such as meter, rhythm, inflection, and the difference in the vowel values. Speaking or singing, the vowels proceed from dark to bright in this order: oo, o, ah, a, e. Try it. Oo, o, ah, a, e. Freeze the frame and try it a couple of times by yourselves. You will also hear this difference when singing through the same vowels, and I have a bad cold, so it may not come off as well as it should, but I think you'll hear it. And writers, whether they are musicians, poets, or playwrights, will pay very careful attention to that. John Keats references it in a poem about youth called A Song About Myself. There was a naughty boy. A naughty boy was he. He would not stop at home. He would not quiet be. He took, in his knapsack, a book full of vowels, and a shirt with some towels, a slate cap for nightcap, a hairbrush, a comb ditto, new stockings for old ones would split-o. This knapsack, tight at its back, he riveted close, and followed his nose to the north, to the north, and followed his nose to the north. Does a boy running away from home with only one knapsack in his possession take a book of vowels with him? Only if he's a poet. But let us allow a master, the late great Canadian Shakespearean actor, William Hutt, who never went to Hollywood, and who was one of the few people left who understood these matters in the 20th century, give us a concrete example through his own speech. Please turn up the volume a bit.
Listen to this and tell me, ere the shard-born beetle with his drowsy hums hath wrung night's yawning peal, there shall be done a deed of dreadful note. That's an extraordinary sequence of vowel sounds that Shakespeare has put together, because it's Macbeth thinking about the death of Banquo. And his wife is sitting beside him. He's saying, ere the shard-born beetle with his drowsy hums hath wrung night's yawning peal, there shall be done a deed of dreadful note. All those vowel sounds are ominous sounding vowel sounds. And that is extraordinary writing, to match all those vowel sounds so that what you get from underneath it is this man's just on the verge of going berserk.
How do you hear that? That would never have occurred to me.
Listen to the sounds.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what we have. Whether we're classical actors or not, what we have is the sound of our voices,
Right.
and the sound that comes from the language itself. You put all those vowel sounds together, and you've got a pretty ominous sounding concerto there.
Let me introduce a third reason for reading poetry aloud. Mr. Hutt refers to that's what we have, the sound of our voices and the sound that emerges from the language itself. And sometimes that sound is the only thing that can convey the meaning adequately, if the idea is understood by the mind, of course. Great poets are fond of what I call zingers, where the last line or couplet in a poem completely turns your idea of what you thought you were talking about upside down. Here's a short one by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Seeing it in print would not give you the idea in the same way as hearing it does. It's entitled Theology. There is a heaven forever. Day by day the upward longing of my soul doth tell me so. There is a hell, I'm quite as sure. For pray, if there were not, where would my neighbors go? It can be done better, I'm sure, and I invite you to try. It's a good place to start in reading a poem correctly. Now, the most stupid, unpoetic, anti-poetic thing I've ever heard of is a website that has computers read the poem out loud. Without the mind, reading it out loud is a mistake. Listen to what they do with this one.
There is a heaven, forever, day by day. The upward longing of my soul doth tell me so. There is a hell, I'm quite as sure, for pray. If there were not, where would my neighbors go?
Let's come back to Keats. The change in idea and the change in sound work hand in glove together. Imagine if we took the fourth verse of A Song About Myself and read it the same way as we read the first verse. There was a naughty boy, and a naughty boy was he. He ran away to Scotland, the people for to see. There he found that the ground was as hard, that a yard was as long, that a song was as merry, that a cherry was as red, that lead was as weighty, that fourscore was as 80, and that a door was as wooden and in England. So he stood in his shoes and he wondered. He wondered. He stood in his shoes and he wondered. Yuck! There's an idea being conveyed here, an idea which requires change. Many of us have grown up in a situation with prejudices that we just took for granted. If you grew up in England in Keats' time, it was just assumed that, well, that's the way the Scots are. And he went to see them and he suddenly found that they were people just like anybody else. It was a revelation to him. And you have to capture that discovery, the type of discovery that helps you overcome lifelong prejudices in the way you read the poem. I'll give it a try. There was a naughty boy, and a naughty boy was he. He ran away to Scotland, the people for to see. There he found that the ground was as hard, that a yard was as long, that a song was as merry, that a cherry was as red, that lead was as weighty, that fourscore was as 80, that a door was as wooden as in England. So he stood in his shoes and he wondered. He wondered. He stood in his shoes and he wondered. Again, it can be done better, and I invite you to try. Did you notice how Mr. Hutt vibrates certain consonants at the end of a word, such as rung or hums? That goes together with the vowel sounds. There is a move afoot to eliminate double consonances in the English language. A double consonance means you're actually supposed to produce both consonances, and therefore that consonant lasts longer. Their argument? We can't afford to take the time, to make the effort, to pay attention to all these matters. My response? You must afford to take the time, to make the effort, to pay attention to all these matters. Some of you may be saying, well, it's getting a little bit arcane here, Fred. To you I answer, bear in mind that there have been efforts to destroy language since the post-war period. In his notorious book, 1984, George Orwell invented the idea of a new language, Newspeak. But it was being carried out at the time. The task of the editors of Newspeak in his novel was to shrink the dictionary, reduce the number of words. That's what newspapers around the world did. More insidious, the positive notion of words was eliminated. Good became the opposite of ungood. Ungood was the substantial. It was what got you into trouble. Good was the opposite, what kept you out of trouble. But a notion of the good, in Plato's sense of that word, didn't exist. Aldous Huxley, in his equally notorious dystopian novel, Brave New World, poses the question for the oligarchy, what do we do about Shakespeare? How are we going to stop him from educating people? If we ban him, they're just going to want to know more. They'll get curious and they'll learn from him. No, they say, what we shall do is we shall dumb the people down so much that they can't even understand Shakespeare, and we'll just let him reign freely and he won't pose any danger to us. In school, we studied a Shakespeare play every year for 6 years. Nobody got anything out of it. Nobody understood it. And largely because the teacher didn't understand it. And that brings me to my fourth and final reason for reading poetry aloud. Our people are becoming increasingly illiterate. They substitute obscenities for language. Their vocabulary is shrinking. They don't speak in sentences. And how they speak determines how they think. And how they think determines how they speak. Speech and thought share a mutually assured destruction compact. Some people don't know if they're reciting verse or an apple. Is that a poem you're reciting or a poem? I am not suggesting that people will improvise poems when speaking to one another, but a population that is becoming more literate through learning how to recite poetry, that is going to be reflected in how they communicate with their neighbors, communicate ideas. Our media is literal, without irony, without humor, without elaboration. CNN can take 2 minutes worth of news and stretch it out for 2 days, 3 days. They can turn the people into an enraged mob and lynch a public figure without bringing up a shred of evidence against him, just as Iago manipulated the jealous Othello without even producing the scarf. We require a more literate culture and therefore a more poetic culture, not just in terms of us reading poetry, but in the way that we communicate with each other on a daily basis. A poetic people are going to ask questions and not just simply accept everything that is shoved down their throats by the media. So I will close with a recitation of a complete sonnet by John Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer. I will post the sonnet for you now for your perusal. Read it out loud. If there's a group of you, discuss how it should be read after each reading. I will give you a clue. Keats wrote it as a young man, a college student. He had read Homer's Iliad many times and could not understand it. Finally, Chapman produced an honest translation, and it was a revelation to Keats, a true discovery. And he compares it to discoveries in astronomy and exploration. But I am going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask you to attempt reading through the sonnet several times on your own to figure out how it should go before you listen to me. Figure out how the musicality of the voice, including tempo and meter, changes as the discoveries are made. So, freeze this video, either look back to what I put on the screen or print out a version of it, and spend some time reading it aloud before you listen to me. So here goes. On first looking into Chapman's Homer by John Keats. Much have I traveled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards in fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne, yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. It is not good for young people to sit around and say, oh, we'll never know as much as these people did. And it is not good for the older generation to bemoan the fact that the young people today simply were deprived of an education and blah, blah, blah. You are the future. And future generations always have to improve on previous generations. Always. And the older generations are insane if they don't want to see that. So please do as I ask. I've given you 3 recitations in this presentation. All can be improved on. Try to do it. Or pick your own. But go for it.